Hi again then guys, and we don't usually of course do a specific car review on a Sunday. It tends to be Rivals for instance, but today I was sorting out some of the giveaway stuff for the 15k with the grand prize and the game, sorting all that stuff out, so I didn't have quite as much time, and so I still wanted to put something out for Gran Turismo Sport, and what better way to do so than feature another car from the 1.11 pack, a car which is probably one of my least favourites of the pack, maybe even last for me, to be honest, the Ferrari 512 BB, which of course is Berlinetta Boxer. And there is one thing in particular which I do actually really like about this car, and that is the choice of engine. Now Ferrari, as well as some others as well, Porsche of course, they still do, Subaru as well, is one of those manufacturers which go out of their way to make a boxer engine vehicle or vehicles. Now with the 911, that's always been the case. With the Subaru Impreza, that's always been the case. With Ferraris, it was more so back in the day, and this is a perfect example of that. Now for those who are unfamiliar completely with what a boxer engine is, also called a flat engine, or scientifically speaking horizontally opposed, which doesn't sound quite as cool as a boxer, what that actually means, in its simplest, most basic essence, is that instead of the pistons going up and down in cylinders which are for the most part vertical, or sometimes offset a little bit in the case of a V-type engine, in a boxer engine they are horizontally opposed. So the pistons are literally moving side to side away from each other from a common centre rather than up and down in a straight line in the case of something like a Mitsubishi Evo for instance, or any car with a straight 4 engine, or of course opposed slightly in the case of a V-type engine, just that offset by a little to make it the V-type. That's what gives it the name. With a flat engine, there are certain advantages, some slight disadvantages, but the disadvantages of these engines tend to be more so in the real world than in a game. In a game, they're actually quite good, because they're naturally quite torquey. They are very easy to tune, generally speaking. Beetles can be tuned up quite well, of course Porsches can, Imprezas can, and this car is actually a very responsive vehicle, a very responsive engine to being tuned on Gran Turismo 6 and now on GT Sport as well. Because in fact on Gran Turismo 6, this particular car is actually one of the quickest 70s cars in the game in terms of straight line speed, in particular top end speed. It can do around or even over 250 miles per hour even without NOS or slipstream. That's impressive. It's very impressive. In fact, that means that on Gran Turismo 6 it's actually faster than some other newer Ferraris, even including something like a F430 for instance. You would probably not assume that, but that's the way it is. Now on Gran Turismo Sport, well, it's not quite as dominant, let's just put it that way. It's not a bad car for sure, the handling is definitely more authentic, the suspension is a little bit softer, a little bit more wallowy, which is of course what you'd want from a 70s car to make it feel like that, because even the majority of performance cars were not as tight and as taut and as track focused as they are now. They did tend to be powerful, more straight line machines for the most part, especially if you're talking big Italian supercars, which this was. Now, as far as what you get in its stock form, you're looking at a reasonably large engine. Even by today's Ferrari standards, it's quite big, a 4.9 litre. It's putting out 354 horsepower, which is pretty good for the 70s, 332 pound-feet of torque, and it weighs perhaps a little bit more than you might expect. I would say it weighs more than it looks. It looks like maybe a 1300 kilo car. It actually weighs 1400, so a little bit more than ideal, but of course you can drop it. This car that I'm driving is running level 1 power with level 5 weight loss, so it weighs a lot less than that. But in its stock form, you're still looking at a pretty decent 253 horsepower per tonne, which is around the level of a really good hot hatch, to put it into some perspective. Such as, for instance, a really good hot hatch, a higher level 1, maybe even a track day kind of hatchback. So it's a pretty decent spec sheet, especially for its age. It's a good rival for something like the old school Countach from Lamborghini, and it was, again, on Gran Turismo 6, a great rival for that also. But as far as its usability for the moment in GT Sport, it is really cool to see more and more classics being added to the game, but in a case of a vehicle like this, or the Countach as well actually, I think that we do still need to have more classics for these cars to really begin to come into their own, because as good as they are, they need their rivals to thrive. Because the simple fact is, a car like this, or the Lamborghini, and some others too, they can go up against modern cars, but there simply isn't enough room in the world of Gran Turismo Sport for them to do that as effectively now as they could on Gran Turismo 6. And that's not a bad thing. It's kind of a bad thing for those who want to use the car more, but it's a more realistic thing, because a 1970s Ferrari should not be capable of keeping up with a year 2000 Ferrari, for instance, or a newer one. On Gran Turismo 6, you could do that if you tuned it correctly. Now, in racing form, a 70s Ferrari race car, of course, could keep up with certain newer Ferrari race cars, but mainly because restrictions would allow it to, and the lack of restrictions would allow it to. Whereas for a road car, forget it. It wouldn't even come close. That's why stuff like the F40 later on stood out so much. Not that this is a bad car, but it is nice to see that it's much more realistic now in terms of how good or not good, or how competitive or uncompetitive a car like this or the Countach should be. They are still good, but they're not overly good. They're not OP by definition like they were really on Gran Turismo 6. The Countach especially was definitely an OP car at the 500 pp level. Brilliant machine, and it's great. It's great for that game. You can justify it because many of the cars are unrealistic, whereas now, although we still have OP vehicles, they're not as frequent, and that's something, of course, which I have discussed before with other vehicles. But overall, I think that if you are a fan of the BB, I think you'll like this one. It's not as fast as it used to be, but it is still fun. It sounds great, for sure. It sounds better now, I think, than it did on GT6. Plus the fact that we can paint it immediately, for me personally, does make me like it more. Because we could paint it before, but if I recall correctly, I think it was still two-tone, whereas I vastly prefer it with this completely paintable body shell. And as you can see here, I've gone full old school, almost like prototype Ferrari race car, with the red on red and the yellow old school tinted lights. So for me, that really puts the cherry on the cake. The two biggest improvements are the paint level and the sound. Plus, I would say in third place is the authenticity of the suspension in particular. Apart from that, it's relatively tail happy, as you'd hope an old school Ferrari would be, and the engine is great. The engine is one of the best aspects of the car. It's kind of the centerpiece of the design. So yeah, if you get the chance to check it out, certainly do so, but don't set your hopes too high, because it's not as nimble as the Countach, and I would say it probably never will be, regardless of how you tune it. So overall, definitely worth checking out. It is one of the slightly more affordable cars of the pack, so if you're a classic fan, sure, give it a look. But that's it for this pick overall. Of course, I'll see you guys next time, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.